Oliver is a happy man and a farmer to boot. He loves the cheque he receives every year from Europe's taxpayers and consumers.
First of all, the price went up from about £110 a tonne to £125 a tonne, simply because the world is now short of wheat, so economic forces drove it up. But best of all, the subsidy went up too. And so this year, for example, I will get a cheque around about Christmas for £192,000, and last year I got a cheque for £150,000. So if the price goes up by 20% and the subsidy goes up by 25%, it isn't surprising that this farmer is a very, very happy man indeed.
Oliver the happy farmer employs 4 men. He farms an 800-hectare spread, so he receives almost £200,000 a year in subsidies from Europe's taxpayers.
It seems to me to be completely and utterly crazy, although very nice indeed, to have a system whereby as the price goes up, the subsidies goes up too. Last year this happened in a small way, and I thought it was a mild eccentricity that would correct itself. This year it's happened in a big way, and it's serious lunacy. But I'm not complaining. I love it. If you, the taxpayers of Europe, want to give me, a farmer of Europe, a great deal of money, I'm not going to complain. But I would have to say to you, I think you're crazy. I wouldn't do it if I were you, but as the recipient of all this money, wonderful. Thank you very much. Do I need the money? An interesting question. I have a big fancy Mercedes car with a huge engine, central heating in my house. I like to take holidays. I like to drink French wine. I like to eat good food. I have a very prosperous lifestyle. And therefore, yes, I do need the money.
Millions and millions flow from the rest of society into farming. No other sector receives nearly as much in subsidies. In fact, Europe's taxpayers and consumers shell out £100 billion a year in farm subsidies, a figure so huge that it's hard to grasp. Denmark is currently building a bridge. When it's finished, it'll be the longest suspension bridge in the world. If European farmers could get by without subsidies, we could build 50 of these bridges every year, or build whatever else we thought Europe needed.
If you took the money away today, just like that, I would be in trouble. But if you took the money away gradually and said, okay, I bring news from Brussels. Prepare yourself, Mr. Walston, because in 5 years' time there will be no subsidies at all. And you now have 5 years to adjust your business. Yes, I could survive. If you came back in 5 years' time, you would not find me driving a very big Mercedes. That's no hardship. I can drive a little car. But I would survive. But at the moment, the subsidy you're giving me is enormous and enables me to have a very comfortable lifestyle. So once again, I say to the taxpayers of Europe, both in England and in your country in Denmark, thank you very much, but you're crazy.
Farmers' unions in Europe have always fought for improved subsidies. But even within their ranks, there are people who've become more and more certain that agriculture could certainly do without those hundreds of billions. For 10 years, this man was chief economist at one of the most important farmers' unions in Europe. 2 years ago, he left the British National Farmers' Union, and now he's ready to speak out.
Let me be absolutely clear. You do not need support for food production in Europe. if we were to remove support tomorrow, I do not believe that the level of food production in Europe would drop very much.
This programme looks at why the billions continue to flow into the agricultural coffers. The hunt for an answer takes us to central Spain. From the villages around Madrid, thousands upon thousands of lights twinkle into the darkness. The country is waking up, and the tractors are heading for the fields to pick grapes. The problem is that the growers grow too much, and they insist that they'll go on doing so.
¿Qué vamos a comer si lo arrancan las viñas? Piedras. Comemos piedras de las que hay.
What would we live off if we cleared our vineyards? Stones? Are we to eat stones like those? If they want us to clear the vineyards, they'll have to kill us first. What are we to do on our lousy wages? They'll have to kill us.
A ver.
Far too much wine is made in Europe, especially of the mediocre kinds that come from districts like these. What's more, Spain has more than doubled her output of cheap table wine since she joined the EU. Because agricultural subsidies have assured both a buyer and the price, despite the fall in wine consumption. So the EU has been flooded by wine. But the growers' demands to be allowed to grow grapes weigh heavily, and so a solution had to be found. And the Common Agricultural Policy found one. The grapes arrive from the village. They won't end up as wine. If they did, they'd just end up in storage, and EU politicians have painful experience of that. So a new use has to be found for the wine. The idea comes from the ancient art of distilling, where alcohol is extracted from the wine. But the market would be flooded in cheap brandy, so all that's done is to extract the alcohol and send it to Brazil, where it's used as fuel for cars. So Europe's taxpayers start by subsidizing wine production and then ship the wine as heavily subsidized fuel for Brazilian motorists.
The politicians have placed themselves in a position where they find it incredibly difficult to cut farm support. They've created this system which they've really lost control of. It exists on its own.
The EU has tried to slow down the overproduction of wine through a special kind of subsidy. This Spanish grape grower received £1,700 per hectare for pulling all his vines up by the roots. Once the vines have gone, empty fields remain. But the grower now plants wheat and receives subsidies from the EU for doing so, even though everyone knows there's no chance the wheat will ever grow. On the Spanish plateau, it's simply too arid for wheat.
Como agricultor, catastrófica. Me parece decepcionante.
As a farmer, I think it's a disaster, a huge disappointment. As a farmer, I want to grow something I can make money on. Money I've worked for, not charity.
No vivir de la limosna, como he dicho antes. Solo de las subvenciones.
But we live off the subsidies, and only the subsidies. But the failure of the wheat to appear doesn't matter, because the grower just goes to the local cooperative and obtains the forms which will allow him not to harvest it and still claim the subsidy.
Este es el certificado que nos envían del Ministerio de Agricultura.
This is the certificate which gives us dispensation. It's ridiculous. It's the same as turning us into bad farmers.
Es hacernos malos agricultores, en una palabra.
Politicians in Europe will not act until they are forced to act. The last thing politicians in Europe do is have a strategic plan for agriculture. They exist really on a hand-to-mouth basis, as we say. They will react only when there's a crisis.
On the Spanish plateau, the growers continue to grow grapes there's no use for, all paid for by subsidies. And they're pressing for this system to continue. That's why they get paid for pulling up their vines while planting out new vineyards in new areas.
Nosotros lo que no queremos es que nos arranquen, preferimos estar así, penando, a ganar un dinero.
We refuse to give up our farms. We would rather work and earn our money, not stand around doing nothing. I can just see us giving up our farms now and then next year not having anything to live off. We don't want them to destroy our vineyards. We want more vineyards, so we've enough work for a whole month.
Para pasar el invierno.
The growers' demands are taken very seriously in Spain. No more vineyards are to be destroyed, no more vines uprooted. This message has got through very clearly to the Spanish government.
Que no se arrancará una hectárea de viñedo.
Not
con
a
carácter
hectare of
obligatorio
vineyard will be
mientras sea
uprooted
ministro
because of
de
EU
Agricultura
pressure
o
while I'm a minister, I guarantee.
They have the power in theory, but they do not have the political will or the political nerve to really tell farmers and their extended families the true situation. They are not prepared to say to farmers what they have said to people working in steel mills, people working in coal mines, people working in fishing industries. Their politicians have said, your industry is too large. Your industry has got to be reduced. We have to allow unemployment in these regions. We're going to help you to find other jobs, but we cannot justify all you people working in your traditional industries. They do not have the nerve to say that to farmers.
What would happen if subsidies disappeared? There's only one corner of European agriculture where anybody has investigated in depth. The tobacco harvest in Greece. For tobacco is grown in Europe, and it costs Europe's taxpayers over £1 billion, £3 million a day, to keep production going. A tobacco buyer is on his way. His visits used to be awaited with tension and nervousness. As in other sectors, the price the buyer was willing to pay was vital. But today his visits don't mean that much. The problem is that it's far too expensive to grow tobacco in Europe. So Europe's taxpayers have to pay massive subsidies for every single kilo of tobacco, so that the price can be brought down to a level where anybody will buy it. And that is why there's no connection between the price the buyer pays and the subsidy. Yet bargaining goes ahead, like in the old days. In 1994, this grower sold his tobacco for about 30 drachma a kilo. The EU added another 870 drachma in subsidies, so the grower pocketed 900 drachma. A tobacco harvest means you need tobacco factories, even though half the tobacco grown is so poor that it can't be sold on the normal market. Until a few years ago, for example, some of Italy's tobacco was exported, heavily subsidized, to Albania and incinerated. Incineration has now stopped, so now we sell Italian and Greek tobacco to Russia for a third of the price EU citizens have paid for it. Twice, people in this building have tried to penetrate the hermetically sealed world of the tobacco subsidies. The EU has auditors. When the auditors investigated tobacco for the first time in 1987, taxpayers were shelling out 800 million ecus. 5 years later, the figure has doubled. When we decided to do a new report in 1992, the tobacco budget was 1.4 billion ecus, and we wanted to know if the money was being sensibly spent. The auditors concluded that not only was the tobacco subsidy a waste of taxpayers' money, but an abuse of it. The Greek Minister of Agriculture defends the doubling of expenditure.
We've got to feed these people. If we don't feed them, they'll do something else. If you're hungry, what are you going to be doing? Needed is, we are speaking here of what? Of cars or tractors? They are human beings. You've got to give them something else to do. What are you going to do? Throw them on the streets? They are not, things. They are living things. So people get very angry. They take the streets. You have demonstration. You have social unrest.
The auditors have examined the social need argument, and nobody need go hungry. For if EU taxpayers told all the tobacco growers, you can stop growing tobacco, you needn't work in the fields any longer at all, but we'll pay you precisely the same amount as you receive now, taxpayers would save half of the many billions they are paying out in tobacco subsidies today. If European taxpayers wanted to save £500 million in this little corner of agricultural subsidies alone, these people would not need to go hungry. Yet the scheme has the Europoliticians' seal of approval.
Governments have problems, real problems. And because all of these things, they don't come to their likings, they always blame the government. If I cannot really come with good things, with a basket with a lot of things for the farmers, I have a problem. The government has a problem, no matter which government is in position.
Some of the best paid civil servants in Europe work for the EU Commission. They also enjoy the tax breaks that go with employment by the Commission. It's from these buildings in Brussels that the vast sums find their way to farming. This is where the subsidy arrangements are conceived and designed, for this is the home of the Commissioner for Agriculture, and known as DG6. Over 1,000 employees make DG6 by far the biggest in the whole Commission, and DG6 spends half of the entire EU budget. From these corridors, no proposal to wind down agricultural subsidies has ever been heard. No analysis has ever been undertaken of what would happen if subsidies were removed over a period of 5 to 10 years. And those responsible don't think it would be a good idea anyway.
Ich bin mir sicher, dass wir in den kommenden Jahren
I'm quite sure that in the years to come, we will not be able to accept the liberalization of every market in Europe and just drop the subsidy system we have in Europe, and which is firmly anchored in the common agricultural policy. The Sugar Committee is gathering in a DG6 conference room. From here, bureaucrats run sugar production. The price of sugar is decided, as is who may produce how much of the quotas each member state has been allocated. Quotas which the farmers own. The system is known as the Sugar Scheme. But even though DG6 has never suggested abolishing it, other people have. 70% of the sugar grown in Europe is used by industry, by industrial sugar users. For years, this industry has fought for the abolition of the sugar scheme. It would result in a drop in sugar prices of at least a quarter, but their struggle has been in vain. And as the chairman of the Industrial Users of Sugar says,
I mean, all the answers we've had to date of what's wrong with it. It's perfect. Nobody complains. It's interesting. The point they make, they say, the consumer doesn't complain. Well, the consumer doesn't know. That's why he doesn't complain.
once a week, civil servants from each European capital fly to Brussels for a meeting of the Sugar Committee. Many other civil servants do likewise. The entire Common Agricultural Policy is run by civil servant committees. So for other agricultural products such as grain, tobacco and wine, there are 28 committees in total. These 28 also meet once a week or a fortnight in Brussels, so the European air corridors are a buzz of activity. Each committee meeting is attended by about 50 people. Each meeting has interpreters, minutes are written, proposals distributed, and anything else that goes with such a system.
The Commission are very open and very willing to meet us, which they do. I have to say, I think they meet us because then they can say, well, we met with them, we've spoken to them. They don't do anything. No response. No response at all, apart from them to say it's far too radical and politically unacceptable. Don't be naive. You can't make these changes.
"200,000 Europeans work in the sugar industries Tom Harrison represents. For years, these industries have proposed that sugar subsidies be dropped entirely.
The net result, if you do it in the way that we would propose, is we would have lower consumer prices, we would have a more competitive industry, we would have sugar produced in those areas of the Union which are best suited to produce sugar, and that was the whole idea of the Union. The whole idea was that we would grow materials in the most efficient areas and then move it back. Well, we have fixed national quotas. It's a nonsense, absolute nonsense.
But the Agricultural Commissioner disagrees.
Ich habe ja nie gesagt, dass wir nichts tun sollen oder dass das, was wir jetzt
I've never said we should not do anything and that things are as good as they can be. But I oppose radical methods where one pulls the trees up by the roots. That would be deadly for hundreds of thousands of European farmers. That's my view. On the other side of the globe, there's a peculiar country. Peculiar because farmers there live without subsidies. The country is New Zealand, and it's now 12 years since farm subsidies disappeared.
We're not trying to say it was easy to go away from them. There have been some people who have really struggled, but you would really find it hard to find farmers here who would go back to the old system. They much prefer the freedom to be able to decide themselves rather than have a government or a bureaucrat looking over their shoulder telling them what to do.
Brian Chamberlain was the New Zealand farmers' leader when subsidies were abolished. 8,000 farmers would be forced to abandon their farms, so everybody said. The actual number was 800.
We've certainly proved that it is possible to farm without subsidies. More than that, I think we have proved that the things that people say would happen if you farmed without subsidies, it would be bad for the environment. Many people would leave the land. Neither of those things have applied here in New Zealand.
It's 5 a.m. and work on the farm begins for Andra Neely and her husband. They have 3,000 or 4,000 sheep and 300 head of cattle. The farm is in what the New Zealanders call the Badlands, but even in this inaccessible mountain region there are no complaints about the abolition of subsidies.
It is just, I don't know whether it's nice, but that's the reality. And I mean, if I owned a business in any other sector of the economy, I would be dependent on my own decisions. So, you know, why should farmers be any different?
12 years ago, almost half their income came from subsidies, just like in Europe today. So they know the thinking behind agricultural subsidies.
It always has a very good intention. It is to solve a particular problem. Ultimately, they become a reason for being themselves. They actually gain a life of their own, and they build and build, and more people get pulled into having a vested interest in continuing the subsidy. And we actually found that we were supporting a whole raft of people who actually weren't adding to our business, they were just adding to our costs.
This is where the New Zealand Ministry of Agriculture is located, or was. In its heyday, 6,500 people worked for this ministry. Then subsidies were abolished, and the 6,500 became 450.
It was bureaucrats, it was the Ministry of Agriculture, it was all these consultants, it was a huge range of people, and they actually were just, we have a saying we talk of people as being ticket clippers. They actually add nothing to the product, but it goes through their hand and they pay, and they get paid 2 or 3% for the pleasure of putting it through their books. Well, we can do without those people. So that's the answer in Europe, is really the farmers are still here in New Zealand, the land is still producing.
You're in the Paris Basin and you see some of the best agricultural land in the world. And in many European countries there's just wonderful farming land. There's actually very good farming techniques being applied, and to think that these people are actually choosing not to compete with the rest of the world because they claim that you can't do it without subsidies is just the most fantastically amazing thing that I've ever heard.
But DG6 in Brussels doesn't think we can learn anything from New Zealand.
Neuseeland ist in dem Zusammenhang für Europa ein ziemlich unpassendes Beispiel, und Sie dürfen nicht übersehen, dass wir ja
New Zealand is an extremely unsuitable example in the European context. You mustn't forget that we live in an ecologically highly sensitive area. Imagine what would happen to your water resources if they were jeopardized, or the roads in the Alps if the fields and forests were no longer cultivated. And this costs money and has to be paid for.
Das muss bezahlt werden.
In New Zealand, practical experience shows that the environment is the true winner when subsidies are removed. For example, the use of artificial fertilizer dropped instantly by 50% when subsidies disappeared. And lots of land that was only cultivated because of the subsidies was taken out of use.
And in fact, people probably said, isn't this terrible? Here is land that we have worked so hard on to bring into production, and now it's going to go back. And that's what we farmers would say, that if it's not growing grass and not producing sheep and it's not producing cattle, we would say that's going back, and that is really bad. But 10 years later, in retrospect, I think we say to ourselves, for land like this, trees is a better use of it. You know, that's one of the debates between Europe and New Zealand. They would refer to letting land go back to nature as desertification. I would say that it is regeneration. And I think as far as the quality of your soil and water and air is concerned, this is a better use for poor land than trying to scratch a living from it. That's impossible really to make.
Every single year, hundreds of thousands of European farmers have to give up, and they have to quit their farms. This French town is dying. It's located in the south of France and has existed for 1,000 years. Down the centuries, its wealth was based on agriculture. Just 30 years ago, it was full of people and animals. There were hotels, cafes, shops, and everything was kept in motion by the 100 farms outside the town. Today, agriculture can barely keep 4 families alive, and all 4 farms are fighting to survive.
The future for small farmers in Europe is rather bleak. They are a species which is going to die out in a matter of years.
These abandoned farm buildings are the image that haunts. Europeans want to stop this tendency and think they can do so by subsidizing farmers. For most European taxpayers believe that the subsidies go to these modest families. We taxpayers and consumers pay hundreds of billions to safeguard small, poverty-stricken farmers a reasonable standard of living, but the truth is very different. It's the few big farmers who cash in the bulk of agricultural subsidies. "20% of the biggest farmers receive 80% of the subsidies, and the vast majority, the 80%, get only 20% of the money, and that's how it's always been.
The agricultural system of support in Europe does not provide enough support to keep smaller farmers in business.
So it's not the French smallholders who get the bulk of the agricultural subsidies.
Pomero, you were the one.